Hey, what's up guys, welcome back, and I hope you had a fantastic new year. I wanted to kickstart 2020 with a brand new video series that I put together showing a full CG visual effects shot from start to finish. We're going to be covering a lot of information, everything from how to set up your Maya scene file, doing file referencing, materials, V-Ray lighting, V-Ray rendering, as well as render passes, render layers, and the overall batch render process. Next, we're going to jump over to After Effects and then composite with multi-channel EXR files, and then render out a final preview file. So there's going to be a lot of information in these videos. I was trying to speed it up and not linger too long on certain subjects, but I did try to explain what we're doing, not just which buttons to press. I'll also have links in the description so you can jump ahead to specific points. If that sounds interesting, let's get started. So for this tutorial, we're using a model of a T38, and I downloaded the model from TurboSquid, which is available here, done by EGP Jet 3D. Now the model is free, but I made several modifications to the plane, including adding extra detail, modified textures, and some extra detail in the geometry, as well as the two pilots in the cockpit. So if you'd like to use the one on TurboSquid, go ahead and download it from the site. Otherwise, you can check the link in the description and download my modified version. Just be aware that I do not own the rights to this model, so I would appreciate it if you did not distribute it without crediting the original author. The very first thing that we need to do is make sure we have our folders and projects set properly. So I have a project folder set up, and inside the project folder I have an assets folder. This is for objects we'll be referencing, such as the plane. We have a scenes folder. This is for the Maya scene files, and a source images folder. At this point, these are the only folders that we need. I don't recommend doing the automated approach, which will generate a lot of folders that we will never need. This keeps our folder hierarchy pretty clean, and we can create more as needed. So we need to set our project here, copy this path up to File, Set Project, paste in the path, and then click Select Folder. Now we need to create a workspace, so just create a default workspace, and then we're good to go. What we need to do now is get our object inside of Maya, and there are two ways to do that. There's importing, which will take that object and save it inside the Maya scene file, and there's also referencing. So referencing has two main advantages, and the first advantage is it allows other people to work on that same model while, let's say, animators start animating it. So in a typical production environment, once you have started on the model, animators will need to start animating with it. So you will want to have people who can work on the files at the same time, so modelers can continue to make changes and animators can at least start working with something. It also allows updating a model with a newer version, very, very simple, or even swapping out to a completely different model entirely. This is very, very convenient. The second advantage is that it keeps your Maya scene files smaller. For example, if you have a very, very large model or a collection of models, and those models are being saved inside each Maya scene file, your scene files could easily be in the hundreds of megabytes or even gigabytes. And if you're saving multiple versions of these files, you're going to use a lot more space. With referencing, you're only going to be looking at one file, and all the scenes that use that reference will point to one object and not have duplicates of that object in each scene. So we're going to be using that method. Let's go up to File, Create Reference, and we're looking in the Assets folder for T38 Talon FBX. Double click. So references are indicated in the outliner with a little blue diamond in the icon. So this means that we can change things like the animations, we can change textures and materials, but we can't change the geometry itself. So changes to the geometry will have to be done on that FBX file directly. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add some animation to this plane. And the way we're going to do this is with some simple expressions. So we're going to go up to Create, Locator, and the locator is going to act as an additional way of being able to move this plane. So when you're moving this locator, you could think of trying to place it where the center of balance is. For a much larger plane, it makes it seem a little bit more realistic if the locator is lower, but for something lightweight like this, you could do something just above the wing. So next what we're going to do, we're going to take this T38 model, middle mouse click and drag it over the locator, and now this locator can be animated with an expression, but we can still animate the plane directly, such as rotation here. Okay, so for this locator, we're just going to call this Turbulence. And then we're going to add an expression to the rotate. So we're going to right click on rotate and create new expression. We have the object and attribute name. We can copy this down here. I'm going to paste this in, and we're going to specifically say rotate X. So we're going to use a noise expression, and we're passing in the time parameter, which will give us a unique number every frame. And we're just going to multiply this by, let's say, a quarter. Then we're going to repeat this step for Y and Z. So we'll just copy this and just change the letters. Right here, instead of doing 0.25, I'll do something like 5 instead. Then we click create. We could just move this off to the side. Now when you use an expression on a channel, you'll get a little purple box, which indicates it's being driven by an expression. And I'm going to extend this timeline to 200 frames. So what we've got right now, the plane is kind of wobbling slightly. So to edit changes, if you don't have your window open anymore, you can just right click and say edit expression. And then when you open up that box again, you just click edit to save those changes. So what we've done, we've added some just slight amounts of turbulence, and doing this type of animation would take a long time to do by hand, and we've done it just in a few seconds. And the reason we have a locator is so we can take this plane and then still be able to animate our own custom animations of it banking or going up and down or whatever we want. Okay, so next we need to create a camera. I'm going up to create camera, just a regular camera. Now I'm going to keep my perspective view, click space, and we're going to go over to a new view, right click over the camera, and then say camera 1, and we're going to position this camera. One of the things that we need to do when setting up a camera is determine the correct focal length. Focal length is absolutely vital when doing visual effects, because if you use a camera focal length that is incorrect, it's going to give away the fact that this is a CG shot. For example, this is by default a 35mm lens. Go into your attribute editor, camera shape, and view it here. A 35mm lens is considered wide angle. So to frame this in the shot properly, we'll want to take our resolution gate, and this indicates what is going to be rendered. You can tell this is wide angle by the foreshortening, so the front end of the plane looks a lot larger than the back end of the plane, but in visual effects you always try to mimic what a camera would see. And if this was for a film or a movie, whatever, it would require another plane to be flying very close to this one so the cameraman can take this shot. But using a focal length of 35 would require the videographer to get very, very close to that plane, and that would be well outside what is considered a safe distance. So if for doing aerial photography, you would want to have your focal length set to something more like 80. 80 is going to flatten the image out, it's going to reduce the foreshortening, and this is going to look more realistic. So if you look at any type of examples of aerial aviation photography or videography, you will more commonly see much higher focal lengths. So I would say 80 is a pretty good low value. You could go all the way up to 120, and that would be considered pretty normal as well. I'm going to leave mine at 80. So right here, we're going to start at frame 0, and I'm going to position the camera somewhere here. I'm going to click S to set a keyframe for all the channels. And then we're going to go all the way to the very end of where we want the animation to stop. So I'm going to say that's going to be probably around 185. I'm going to pop over to a perspective view here so I can cant the angle very slightly, something more like this. And when you're framing the shot, you just want to make sure you have enough space at the edge. So if you wanted to add camera shake or something, which would require you to cut in a little bit off your shot, you still have room at the sides. So something like that will be fine. We just need one other keyframe to keep the plane in the shot. So let's go to frame 120, and we'll just lower that to there. I'm going to pull out a little bit here at the beginning. Now I also have the auto keyer on, so this is why I don't have to keep hitting S. So something like this would be pretty good. So next we're going to go into the graph editor, so Windows, Animation, Graph Editor. And there's a few things that we need to do here. So let's switch over to the channel box. We do not need animations on all of these frames. So what we can do is go up to Edit, Delete by Type Static Channels, and that will remove anything that does not have a keyframe on it. And then right here, I'm going to make these tangents linear. I want the camera to already be moving at the very beginning of the shot, not be stationary. So it's not going to ramp up speed. It's already going to be going pretty fast. So we can come back and tweak these later. For now, this is fine. And I'm actually going to make one more change here. I'm just going to raise this a little bit so it's not going to go quite so close to the edge. So something like that's pretty good. And to do this, we're going to be using V-Ray. Let's go up here to our render settings. So I have V-Ray already set as the default render. And there's going to be quite a few things that we will change here, but we're going to do all of that later. What we do want though is in V-Ray, I'm going to change our max render time down to 0.1. This will limit our render time to 1/10 of 1 minute or 6 seconds. And we're going to go up to GI and make sure GI is turned on. Next, we're going to go up to Create Lights, and we're looking for a V-Ray dome light. Make this a little larger. Now this is only to keep the object out of the way. It doesn't make any difference on how the light reacts. Now we're going to use this dome light to be able to use an HDR image. So we're going to select the dome light, click on Use Dome Text, and then click on Dome Text. Here we're going to go into File, and we're going to look in the Source Images folder. I actually have two set up here. I'm just going to use this one and click OK. Now to see it in the viewport, you're going to click on the little texture switch, and then it is displayed in the viewport. Now I'm going to go into IPR, and then just have a look at what this render looks like. Now, the benefit of using a dome light is that it allows you to use direct and indirect illumination just from the HDR itself, which will become pretty important when we start using passes. Let's go over to a perspective view. I'm also going to turn on texture view there. Okay, so this is completely clipped, which I will talk about in another video of why this is not great to use. But this is an HDR image, so that means we're getting a lot more values than what the monitor can display. So you can change this, but by changing this part here, you're probably going to make everything else a bit darker. I personally don't want to have to look at the sun, because if we look at the sun, we should see lens flares, and I don't want to have to composite lens flares. And to do lens flares properly, you really need dedicated software for it, like optical flares. And I know that a lot of you guys probably don't have that. So I'm just going to cut the camera off before it gets to that point, and then we should not have to worry about the sun. You could also do something from another angle, and that would be fine as well. Now, if you want to rotate your dome light, you can't just rotate this dome. The picture stays static. So what you have to do instead, if you look at the connections in the attribute editor, there is a node called V-Ray Place Environment Text, and this is how you do the rotation. You can also do vertical rotation as well, but for now, I'm just going to leave this at the default. So this next part brings us to surfacing and texturing. Now, this object that I'm using came from TurboSquid, and this was a free object, and this looks pretty different to the one that's available online. So the textures were different. It lacked detail, which I added in. The UVs were not complete. I kind of changed some of the UVs. I did add quite a bit of detail to the tail. You can see, if we go to a wireframe view, there's a few other things that will make this look a little bit more realistic. But overall, it's fairly good. The topology is all right. And we really won't notice any kind of imperfections. Like if we look underneath the wing, you can see that it's just intersecting. One of the most important things to get right in visual effects is time management. And time management is something that a lot of people have a problem with, especially if you're a perfectionist. And I consider myself quite often to be a perfectionist, and it's often detrimental to your ability to get stuff done. So with modeling, if I'm modeling something for myself, I want the topology to be absolutely perfect. I don't want intersections. I want everything to be UV'd perfectly. But for visual effects, it often doesn't matter. So this is not for like doing a game or doing something where the player or where the camera can look at any different angle. For visual effects, if you know that plane is going to be very, very small, like in the distance, you should not spend very long modeling or texturing or surfacing or anything. What's more important is the animation is good and the materials act how they should act from that distance. So in our case, if we look underneath the plane, there is no detail underneath the plane. So there's some detail that I added in the texture, but since the camera is not going to be underneath the plane, we do not need to waste time doing it. So this is one of the most important things to get right. If you can't see it, don't waste time doing it. Or if it's too small or you're not going to see that detail, don't waste time doing it. So let's take a look at the materials we have up. So to make this process a little bit easier, I have sectioned out part of the plane and already given standard Lamberts and Fongs. Now for this, we're going to convert all of these to V-Ray materials, and I'll show you the main jet one and the glass, but the rest I'm just going to skip over because it's the same process. So to determine what object uses which material, there are two ways. You can either click on the object and go to the material, which this uses metal dark, and it also uses jet. Or you can go to a specific material node, right click, hold it down, and do select objects with material. And anything that is highlighted means that it uses that material. Okay, so for this, what we're going to do, we're going to start with jet. I'm going to double click here. We're not going to use the material viewer because V-Ray is not fully integrated with it, and you'll notice that there's lacking quite a few of the options when we convert this. So I'm just going to close the hypershade and we're going to convert this. Now you can't convert it back from a V-Ray material, but all of the standard Maya materials have this type feature that you can change. And what we're looking for is a V-Ray MTL. V-Ray MTL, and that will automatically convert the material to a V-Ray material. And you will notice that the parameters are a little bit different, but they are all going to do more or less the same thing. You just have a lot more control. So also with Lamberts, you don't get any type of reflections, but with the V-Ray materials, you do, of course, get reflections. So let's go into Diffuse Color, File, and we're looking for this T38 color JPEG. When you do that, you can see that's been applied and everything looks okay. So this model here has very, very little detail in it, but in the texture, I added in some panels from a blueprint of a T38 to give the illusion of detail, and that's very, very effective, as you will see a little bit later in this video, that you can't really tell that those are real panels or just lines of panels. It's always better to have this type of detail modeled in. There's a lot more things you can do with it, especially if the camera gets close. You kind of have to do that, but at the distance that we will be viewing this from, you would not be able to tell when this is rendered. So let's just take a brief look at the materials here. So the original textures that came with this looks pretty drastically different. So it does not look realistic to the plane, even though the proportions of the plane are good. You'll also notice that this is not a standard resolution. So standard for UVs is going to be 1:1 or just a square. So what I did, I stretched this up and I compressed the UVs to match the scale. So if you look at the original model, this is going to look a little bit different to the one that I'm using here. So when I redid the materials, the color ended up looking like this. So this is from a blueprint. This is the underneath side, which was not originally in the map. And I also added from a blueprint these panels here. And I added a NASA version of this. Now the proportions of these are not all the same, especially with some of these larger objects here. Like this is for the gear, but the gear is not viewed in this. So I just left them in the UVs, but they're not being used in this version. For this next part here, I'm going to find a good angle that we can start looking at this material. I'm going to have the IPR open, and we're going to start looking at the reflection. Now, a couple things about the V-Ray frame buffer which make this a little bit easier to use. So if you click on this little button here, this allows you to open up some adjustments. So for example, you can go into curves, checkmark curves, and then you can brighten up the image. So these are really good temporary adjustments, so you can see what you could use to composite these later. You can also save this information in a LUT, which I will explain later. So if we zoom in here, you can also see there's quite a bit of faceting. So these hard edges, and this is because V-Ray by default does not automatically render a smooth shaded version. So to change that, we're going to stop the IPR, go up to our render settings, go into overrides, and make sure you check viewport subdivision, and then close it. I'm going to restart the IPR, and now this is changed and it's smooth, how it should be. So while I'm messing around with this camera, I'm also going to change my perspective camera to also mimic the rendered camera. So at an 80mm, then I'm going to render this again. Okay, so this is a pretty good view for us to start looking at some of the materials and start messing around with textures. I'm going to keep the frame buffer open, but I'm going to close down the adjustments tab. I'm going to select the fuselage, go up to this V-Ray material. I'm going to change this material name to match what it was originally. So this is jet. There were no textures provided for reflection or glossiness. I will explain these in a moment. So we are going to have to go in and add in custom maps for these, but for right now, we're just going to add in some settings so we can get a more realistic looking surface, but we will have to break up some of the reflections. Here, what we're going to do, we're going to go down to the reflection type, and there are several types here. I prefer Ward for doing this kind of plain metal, and we're just going to take this reflection color and crank it all the way up. By doing that, we're allowing reflections to be shown. This amount is the amount of reflections. So if this is at black, it's just reflecting nothing, even though the reflections are at 100%. Likewise, if you put this all the way up to white and then you set your reflections to 0, you won't get any reflections. So this amount is for if you have a map placed in here that you can't change the values easily, you can just lower the percentage of how much of that map is being used. Now, glossiness is a way of determining how mirror-like the surface is. So a bathroom mirror would be 100%. You can see your exact reflection. That would be 100%. Something that is going to be a lot more diffuse would be much lower. So if I lower this, your highlights are going to get much smaller and also more diffuse. So at 0.8, this doesn't look nearly as shiny. Now, right now, I'm just going to leave this at 0.9. Unless you're making a mirror, never leave this at 100%. Next thing is we're always going to use Fresnel reflections and we're going to use glossy reflections. But in order to get a little bit more shine on this, I'm going to unlock the Fresnel IOR, which is the index of refraction, to the refraction index of refraction. And what that means is we can change the refraction of the material itself differently to the refraction of the surface. So in this case, I'm going to set my Fresnel IOR to 3, and this is going to give us a nicer looking metal. For this next part here, I'm going to open up this history tab, and we can allow history so we can compare to previous versions. So I'm going to enable history by clicking that power button. You can determine a preset directory if you want to, but I'm just going to use the project path, autosave, and click OK. So autosaving only works with regular renders, not IPR, but since we've already set a maximum render time of 6 seconds, this is perfectly fine to wait. So this took 9 seconds to render. It does its best to hit that 6-second mark, but sometimes it goes over. So right here, we can now compare this to versions in a moment. So for this next part, we're going to open up Photoshop and we're going to take a look at how we can improve the texture. So I've already explained that I made this color image from the original image provided, and I made it into a square as well. It makes it a little bit more convenient to use. We have the bottom side, and then we have the 2 side views. Then we have some accessories here. This for a color map is perfectly fine, and any other types of detail can be added to the reflection maps. I think a lot of beginners and a lot of students especially get confused of how to make a reflection material or rely on software such as Substance Painter to do all of this for them. And Substance Painter and Substance Designer are fantastic pieces of software if you know how to use them and if you know how to customize them. But I found that a lot of students using Substance, if they don't have their connections done correctly or they don't have any map in a reflection map, they'll say, oh, well, my reflection is just 100% white, and that's what Substance said, and that's correct. And that is incorrect. And I do think that it is a good idea to learn how to do things manually so you understand how they work. So we're using Photoshop here, and I'm going to show you how you can create a reflection map. Now in V-Ray, reflection maps are what you might consider to be a specular map, and specularity is a type of reflection, but in V-Ray, specular reflections are calculated automatically. So a specular reflection is just simply going to be a concentrated amount of reflections at a specific angle. Okay, so what we need to do, first of all, a lot of students will create a black and white version. Reflection maps can have color, but in this case, we don't really need any color. So we can just go into select an adjustment layer, go to hue and saturation, and just lower the saturation. We have to understand what a reflection map is actually doing at this point. So for example, anything that is dark would not be reflective and anything that is white would be reflective. But that's not how this material would actually work. So this is just black paint. And black paint is still reflective, but if we were to use this map, there would be no reflections on the nose of the plane. Likewise, with this stripe and these labels here, they would have very, very limited reflections along with this logo, but the rest of the plane would be very, very bright. Any type of decal, if it would be made in the same material, like this kind of paint, has to be removed. I'm assuming that you guys know how to use Photoshop. It is usually a prerequisite for doing this type of stuff. So I'm going to speed up the process. So what you would have to do here, you'd have to select something like the magic wand, select these stripes, go over to your brush, sample the color, and you want to fill this in with an Alt backspace command. And this is a rather tedious process, but it is absolutely necessary for creating a realistic reflection map. You can even use things like the clone stamp tool to repaint some easier parts. Now, if you have a little bit of detail left in, that can often be to your advantage, but in this case, we don't want anything that looks like it's lettering. Any type of detail in the reflection map would simply have to be some kind of like rougher part of the plane or something that's slightly more dirty than the rest of the plane, and that's fine to leave in a little bit of detail. And as I said originally, if this was for a very big budget film or something that would have to be very, very close to the camera, you would want to spend a lot more time making this map very, very nice. But for something as simple as what we're doing, it's not that important. So don't spend a huge amount of time doing this, but you do want to make sure that the reflection map makes sense, because if it doesn't, your visual effects is always going to look off. And the next thing we're going to need to do is find some kind of grungy map to try break up the reflections. So this is another thing that beginners often forget, but very, very clean reflections is going to make your object look like it's CG, and almost no material in the world is going to be perfectly clean. Even if it's polished chrome, you're going to get little tiny scratches here and there. So we're going to find a good map that we could use for this. So here I have this tileable metal material. I'm just going to copy this and paste it in. And I'm going to quickly just tile this over the entire canvas by holding down the Alt key and just snapping it, grabbing a whole section, Control E to merge them, and do the same thing with the Alt key and the Shift key. Merge them all again, move them all the way to the top. So for the blending mode, we'll do something like difference. This will allow the black edges to show up, and then we can lower the opacity. Now, of course, I have not finished this one here. The same thing would have to be done on both sides, but I just want to show you how you can quickly add in some rougher detail. You can go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur, and do something maybe around 2.5 to 3. Just kind of blur those edges a little bit more. You can then add some contrast with a curve, so click Control M to bring up curves. You can have a little bit more contrast there. If you increase the opacity just a tad, do something more like that. So this is a really good way to start using a reflection map. I'm going to keep working on this one, finish this up, and then I'll show you the final result. But something like this would be a good place to start. All right, so here's my completed map. Pretty homogeneous, and there's some edges and areas, but it's going to be fine for what we need. I have removed all of the decals and logos and all of anything that was way too dark. This is going to be fine for what we need. Okay, so now we're back in Maya. Click on our jet model. So in V-Ray, the reflection color indicates what type of values or colors are going to be reflected. The amount is how much of this map or this value is going to be used. Reflection glossiness is going to be the size of the highlight or how diffuse the reflections are. So if it's going to be very mirror-like, as I said, you're going to put this at a very high value. And if it's going to be very low, it's going to be very low value. Okay, so we're going to load in our reflection map here. If you have a specular map, you would put it in your reflection color. You can also put specular maps in glossiness maps if you want to be able to have a more customized and more varied amount of glossiness. So we're going to click on the input connection, go into File. I'm going to load in that reflection. I'm actually going to stop IPR here, so it was a good idea to pause IPR or stop it when you're adding in new textures. And I'm going to do the same for glossiness as well. Even though that these are the same map, since it has no color, we can use it as a glossiness map as well. I'm going to restart the IPR. And now you can see there's a lot more detail on the plane, like all of these highlights here. I'm going to stop this and do a proper render, and then we can compare the history. So going back to the original one that we had, this is going to be down here. This is the one that we had with correct settings on in terms of the amount of reflection color and glossiness. This looks pretty good, but this is with maps on. So this looks a lot more realistic, just with those simple maps that we added on. And here's another useful thing that you can do with the frame buffer. You can set one to be A, one to be B, and you can get a slider so you can go in between them. Between these two renders, you can see that the latest one that we did with those two maps, even just more of a homogeneous grunge map, we've added a lot of really good detail. And it makes the plane look a lot more realistic. I'm going to show you now, we're going to do the glass, and then we're going to go ahead and do the lights on the wings and on the tail. And then the rest will just be up to you to finish up yourself. Okay, so I'm going to minimize this. All right, so let's go ahead and select the glass. We're going to convert this again into a V-Ray material. So the most important things for glass is going to be the reflection and the refraction. So for the reflection color, we can crank that all the way up to white. And glass does have a mirror-like quality to it, so we can leave the glossiness at 100%. Next is going to be the refraction. I'm going to take the refraction all the way up to 100%. This is going to allow the light to pass through it. And then for the index of refraction, this is going to be the amount of distortion we get. This is a fine value to use. You could go a little bit lower or a little bit higher, but I'm going to leave this at the default value. And then I'm going to use FX shadows. Okay, so this looks pretty good. We've got the light passing through, and we also have reflections of the environment that you can see down here. And if we turn around, you should probably be able to see a little bit more clearly. Let's go ahead and do the lights next. So this is going to be the port side light, which is red. Convert this to a V-Ray material. Now for the diffuse color, I do have a texture that I provided for this. It's nothing special, it's just something to give the illusion of detail. It's not even really UV'd. This is our left light. Let's grab that in there. And we can use the same one for our self-illumination color as well. I'm going to load in the same thing. Now, I am actually going to use unique files for these just in case you wanted to change one of them later. Don't forget to change the name. I'm going to turn on self-illumination GI, so this light actually does affect the global illumination. For the reflection color, we can crank that up and then just lower the glossiness quite a bit. And if this light ends up being a little bit bright, we can lower that either in post or go into the color balance and change it there. Same thing for this light. Convert it to a V-Ray material. Let's change the name. Okay, so let's have a look at these. This looks a little bit bright, but the whole point of this exercise is to practice compositing, so this is a good candidate for something that we can reduce or just tweak in post. So for right now, I'm just going to leave it as is. Go to this light up here. This is another light that I have a texture provided. I'm going to convert this to a V-Ray material again. Call this tail light. Now the diffuse color has a map, and so does the self-illumination and reflection color. Now for the reflection color, we're going to take down the reflection glossiness quite a bit, more like that, and that should be good. So the next step here would be to go through the rest of the materials and apply either values, colors, or for some certain things, textures, but don't spend a lot of time doing it because most of the stuff inside the canopy, you're not going to be able to see an awful lot. As long as you get the reflections right, that should be good. And you have some kind of color. But I wanted to show you another way that you can quickly add detail without actually using a texture. So for this part, we're going to grab this engine cover material. We're going to convert this to a V-Ray material like we've been doing. Call this engines cover. Now we're going to lower this value quite a bit. Then in the reflection color input, instead of adding a file, we're going to add in some noise. Adding some noise will add a little bit of variation. We don't really need to change any of the settings, they're fine. But we're going to go back to the output connection, and then we're going to go to reflection glossiness, and we'll add a fractal. So if we look over at the hypershade, we have now added some detail to the reflections without spending any time in Photoshop or Substance. It's just a very, very quick way of adding some extra detail. Okay, so at this point, what you need to do is go all the way through and convert all of the rest of the materials to V-Ray materials, add in reflections, add in colors, and then we'll be ready to go for the next part. All right, so this next part, we're going to do some exhaust. So if we look at the back of the plane here, inside the engines, there are two little cylinders here that you could use as emitters if you wanted to use a particle system. And particle systems are the way to go most of the time. But in this case, our plane is just flying in a straight line. And in fact, it's actually not moving at all. It's just, we will make it look like it is moving just with the camera angle. And we could also move the environment slightly if we wanted to. So instead of using a particle system, we're just going to make some geometry and then use the rendered silhouette as a matte for use in After Effects. So what we can do to begin with here, we can add a cube. Snap this over here, holding down the V key. Go into the settings. For the subdivisions width and height, we can do 4. And then for the depth, we can do 100. Then I'm going to hold down the D key and the V key simultaneously and just reposition the pivot point to the edge of this object, and then I can just scale it out. And we can have this go pretty far. Might be a little bit large. I'll lower this down a little bit. Thing like this. And next what we can do is flare this out at the end because exhaust is going to dissipate as it flies through the air. We're going to first delete the history. So that is under Edit, Delete by Type History. I'm using a custom panel. So now we're going to go over to Deform, and we're looking for Non-Linear, and we'll click Flare. So with Flare, you get this axis. So holding down the J key, we're going to just snap this in place, and then go to the attribute, and then the End Flare control, we're going to increase this quite a bit. We might do something like 4 and 4, so it makes it a bit wider. Next, what we're going to do, we're going to add another deformer, and this one is going to be a texture deformer. Now, on the texture deformer, if you go to the option box, there are several ways you can do this. One is UVs, and if we actually look at the UVs right now, the UVs are not very ideal. They're not in proportion, so we want to go up and just do like an automatic map, and then they'll be in proportion. I'm going to close that down, and then on the texture deformer, click Create. And a texture deformer allows you to add your own texture into this, but I'm just going to add in some noise. Add in some noise, and by default, it's going to give you a very, very crazy result. If we back out, we can go to the strength and just lower the strength. And then if we go back to the input connection, we can increase the frequency ratio, and we can also do things like lowering the amplitude or changing the type. Billow is pretty good, wispy is good. These are all pretty useful. I'm just going to leave mine on billow. And what we want to do is animate this time function right here. And how to do that is just right click, create a new expression. I'm going to copy this attribute here, paste, and we'll just set that equal to time and then click create. So if we scrub forward, it's always going to oscillate back and forth. So this looks pretty good, but it is flat on one side. So we want to change that. Select the object and either go to the texture deformer here, or you can access it in the outliner as well. And we need to change the direction from handle to normal, and that will allow it to go out in both sides. We're also going to click the 3 key to smooth that out. And what we've got is some pretty simple looking exhaust that we can use. If you wanted to do more with that flare, it's also possible to do that. We could make it a little bit tighter at the beginning, so it fits better into the engines, something like that. Okay, so to get the other side, what I want to do is go up to Edit, Duplicate Special. Make sure the option box is checked. This will allow any connections to be preserved, and click Duplicate. Next, we're going to select the copy of the handle and the texture deformer, the new one, and we're just going to move them over. Just something like this. So to make these not exactly the same, we'll select the second one, go into the texture of the texture deformer. On this expression, we can edit that expression. You notice that the expression is now slightly different. This is number 4 instead of what it was before. Add a value to this and click OK. So don't worry if it's a little bit sharp. We're only using this as a matte, so we're only looking at the silhouette that this shape provides. Okay, right, so now we are ready to start setting up our scene for rendering. So we're gonna make use of render layers, so it's this button over here. I already have render layers integrated into the UI. So render layers give us the option of rendering certain objects or lights separately. And it also allows you to specify specific render settings on a per render layer basis instead of the master layer. So what we're looking at right now is this scene layer, which is considered the master layer, and the eye indicates that you're looking at it, and this clapperboard means that this is renderable. So if you batch render this, this means that this layer would render. So right away, we're going to turn this off because we don't want this master layer to render. Instead, we're going to specify 3 separate render layers. One is going to be for the plane, one is going to be for the exhaust, and one of them is going to be for the background. To create a new layer, we're going to just click on this new layer button, and we're going to type in plane. Once you have a layer, you're going to right click over it, and then you can create a collection. Now, collections can hold transforms, which are going to be objects, and you can also do things like shaders, lights, and there's quite a few other options for you there. We're just going to be using transforms, and what we want to do is take this turbulence node, and you can either middle mouse can drag it up, or if you pull this over, there's an option to add an object. So you can add the object in there, or you can simply click and drag it up here. What we've just done is we've added the plane in there, and if we click this little eye, we now switch to that render layer, and you notice that the exhaust goes away. Now by default, all lights will be on all of your layers. Now you can customize this, but for what we need, we do need all of those lights to be across all of the scenes. So I'm going to switch now to my camera view, and I'm going to also go back to our 200 frames here. And we're going to just find a good frame. This will be pretty good for what we need. And then I'm going to go to the IPR. So what we want to have is the plane by itself, and right now we are getting the background in there as well. So the reason we want to separate elements inside of Maya is so that when we work in After Effects, it's much easier to composite. So for example, if we look at the alpha here, the entire alpha is occupied with pixels. And in order to control elements of this plane, like doing color correction or adding some heat distortion or whatever, or adding some kind of depth, it's going to be very, very difficult to control without having a matte of just the plane. And even with a matte pass, it's much more difficult to control if the background is occupied. So we need to go and disable the background from rendering. Let's go into our V-Ray dome light, go into options, and make sure you click invisible. So now you can see the background's gone, and if we look at the alpha is only occupied over the plane. Okay, so I'm going to pause the IPR, and now we're going to go ahead and add a render layer for the exhaust. I'm going to select back on the master layer. I renamed both of these objects exhaust 1 and 2 just to make it a little easier to find. I'm going to create a new render layer, exhaust, right click, create a collection, and then just add these objects, or just middle mouse click and drag them into this collection. Now we can switch to this collection, and now we're only looking at the exhaust. Back to the IPR, and you can see just the exhaust is there. So another really, really useful feature of render layers is the ability to use layer overrides. For example, for this exhaust, we don't really care about the render quality of this, and we don't really care about the fact that there's reflections and global illumination, and it's being illuminated by this HDRI. So what we want to do is make some changes to make this render much, much faster. So if we go up to render settings, we can create an override for any setting inside the render settings window. So we can go up to render using, right click, and create an absolute render override for visible layer. Now, if you don't see this feature, it means that you're still on the master layer, and on the master layer, you can't override it because it is the main settings. You can only override custom layers that you create. So we say create absolute override for visible layer. This will now turn orange, and when it's orange, you should notice that it has added a tab up here called absolute override, and this allows you to change it. So we can say, for example, Maya hardware. So the Maya hardware 2.0 is a very, very fast renderer. If we were to just render a frame of this, you can see it's already done. Less than a second and it's done. And since we don't really care about any of the shading, we only need this as a matte. This is a much, much more efficient way than rendering all the detail and quality that V-Ray can provide. I'm going to close this down. Now, if we go back up to the master layer here, you can see that the master layer still is using V-Ray, and this plane layer is also still using V-Ray. So if you're using Maya for visual effects, or even just for regular rendering, you should be using layer overrides. It is much, much more efficient than trying to just brute force everything. Okay, so next what we're going to do, we're going to create one more override, and this is going to be for the sky. Switch to the sky. So the sky doesn't actually need any objects. And we don't even really need to create our own collection. Collections can be automatically created when we start making override changes. So what we want to do on this, since we turned the sky off inside the dome light, we're going to override that to be on, but only for this sky layer. So we're going to select the dome light, go over to where it says invisible, right click, and do create override for visible layer. When that is orange, you can click the check. Now if we go over to IPR, the sky renders. And you can see that a light collection has been added for us right here, and there's an override on this layer. So next what we're going to do is set up all the render settings for each layer. So we're going to start on the plane layer. We're going to start on the common tab and just work our way down and across all of these other tabs. So the very first thing is what we're calling the file and where it's going to save. So we're going to delete this, but we're going to use a file token here to determine the hierarchy of our file structure. So if you're going to be rendering many versions of the same file, which you probably will be if you're working for a client or even for yourself, you're never going to get it right the first time, and you should never render over previous versions. So we're going to make a folder. We're going to call the folder whatever the version number is. Click version, and then we're going to do a slash. So the slash indicates that it's going to create a new folder. Next, we're going to right click and do layer. So it's going to make a new folder called version and a folder with the same layer name as the one that we are currently rendering. Next, we're going to do another slash, and then this is going to be the name of the file itself. Right click, layer again, underscore, and then the version number. Now you could put your own file name, but if you're using this method, make sure you don't type this in manually. Just right click and select whichever one you want. So many students that I've seen have either written something incorrectly or not exactly how it's written here, and then it won't save any of your files. So it will still render them, it just is not going to save them. You also, if you have a version listed here, you have to have a version labeled. You can't leave it blank. If you leave it blank, again, it's just not going to save it. So in this case, we're going to start with whatever version your file is. I'm on version 2, so I'm going to start on version 2. Next is going to be the image format. You should never use PNGs if you're going to be doing some compositing. Always use EXRs, and for this, we're going to be using multi-channeled EXRs. The multi-channel is going to allow all of the different passes, which I'll explain in a second, to be integrated into a single file. This makes compositing a lot easier, or replacing files a lot easier. Next, we're going to go down into the image format options. This is where you can change a lot of settings. Most of the time, I just leave this at 16 bits. We don't really need full float for what we're doing. You can, but it's going to make your file size a lot larger. We're just going to leave that there. Compression type, leave this on scanline zip. If you use uncompressed EXRs, they'll be enormous. So we're going to definitely compress them. Now this is a lossless compression, so it's fine to use. Okay, so next we're going to scroll down here, open up animation. You need to switch it to standard, and then the end frame is going to be 200. You also want to check render animation only in batch mode. If you don't click this, it will start rendering from the very beginning of the animation. However, if you want to view the animation without batching it, you can uncheck this and view the entire animation as it renders in the frame buffer. So next we're going to click on the renderable camera. This is going to be camera 1. For the presets here, you can just go down to HD 1080. We're rendering in 1920 by 1080. And next we can go over to V-Ray. Now for V-Ray, what we're going to be using, the CPU rendering, we're going to be using a progressive sampler. This is going to be a bit faster than Bucket because we can determine the maximum render time. For this first pass, we're going to keep this pretty low because nearly all the time that you render out something, there's going to be something wrong. There's no point rendering a final quality if you haven't even seen what it looks like in After Effects yet. Next, we're going to go down to color mapping, and we're not going to allow any tone mapping or color mapping. So we're going to set the mode to don't affect colors, only adaptation. There's lots of different types of tone mapping, which I'll hopefully explain in another video, but just take my word for it. If we're going to be compositing all of this, we don't want to use tone mapping here. Next, we're going to go over to GI, and there's not anything you have to change here. Just make sure that it is on. We don't need to change anything in settings. In overrides, you need to go up to camera, and then make sure you enable motion blur. And then make sure viewport subdivision is checked. And there is something we have to do in environment. So let me just move this over. I will switch to IPR so we can see what this is going to look like. Now, previously what we did, we got rid of that background, which is what we wanted to do, but you'll notice that through the glass, that environment is no longer visible, and we need that visible in refractions. So what we have to do is go into our Environment tab, scroll down, enable Override Environment, and then for the refraction texture, we need to load in the V-Ray Dome Light environment. I'm going to pause the IPR here, just move this over. So we're going to select the dome light, go over to our dome light shape, go to the dome text, and we never renamed this file, and usually I don't bother, but for something important like the HDR, we're going to just name this Sky HDR. So now we can go up to the Hypershade, go over to Textures, and then it's easy to find the Sky HDR. Move this over a little bit. Then we're going to middle mouse click and drag this texture into the refraction texture. I'm going to minimize this, go back over to IPR, resume it, and now you can see the sky has been placed back inside the glass. Okay, so now we can stop the IPR, minimize it, and move on. Okay, so the next important part is going to be the render elements. More commonly, these are just called render passes. So render passes are separate attributes of the beauty pass, and the beauty pass is all of the main passes that you need to create the shot that you see in the frame buffer. And by separating out all of these passes, it allows us to composite them in a much easier way. So for example, let's say you render out your plane and you think that the reflections are too strong. Instead of having to go back and re-render the entire thing again, you can simply go to the reflection pass and lower the opacity of that pass in After Effects or play around with the color correction. Likewise, you can do things like change the color of the stripe or change the amount of direct light it receives. There are a lot of different options that you can use here. You can also use diagnostic render passes and some other ones as well. If you would like to find out more information about this, you should check out Chaos Group's documentation. They have a lot of information and a lot of images that go along with these so you can compare what each of them do. We're going to be using a specific type of workflow here that requires some compositing, but not a lot of compositing. We're only going to be using 5 or 6 different passes, so it's going to give us a fair amount of control, but still there's a lot more control you can do with separating things like shadow information. So when you're adding your render passes, make sure you're on the layer that requires render passes. Neither Exhaust nor Sky actually need any render passes, and by adding them from the master layer, you're going to force them on every single layer. And it doesn't take any additional time usually to render out passes, with the exception of diagnostic passes and things like extra text or passes that do not comprise the beauty. The beauty pass is basically whatever the master layer renders and whatever is rendered to the frame buffer. The only thing that takes additional time is physically saving out those individual passes. It doesn't take any additional time to calculate them. So let's go ahead and add in direct lighting. So that's called just lighting. And when you do that, you'll notice that a AOV is added, and AOV stands for arbitrary output variable. Next, we're going to add in global illumination, so GI. Then we're going to need reflection, refraction, and you only need refraction if there are objects in your scene that are transparent or translucent. So we do have glass, so we need refraction. Then we're going to add in specular, and then we're going to do self-illumination. And it doesn't really matter the order in which you add these. And next, we're going to add in an extra text pass. Now the extra text pass is a special type of pass, which is actually an embedded render layer. So extra text passes do actually take longer to render. So whereas render passes generally don't take any additional time to render, render layers and extra text passes do. So a render layer is going to go in a sequence. So for this scene, the first render layer is going to be our plane render layer, then it's going to be the exhaust, and then it's going to be our sky. And just make sure that all of the ones that are rendered have this clapperboard icon turned on. This indicates that they are set to render. We don't need to render the master layer. So the more render layers you have, the longer it will take to render your scene. Generally, the more passes you have, it doesn't really make a difference, with the exception of the extra text pass, because it is in fact a embedded render layer. So we're going to rename this to be AO. This is only for our references. It doesn't change the name of the pass inside of an EXR file. So to change it there, we're going to click on Extra V-Ray Attributes, go into the explicit channel name, and also type in AO. Now for the texture, you can apply whatever type of material you want or whatever type of texture you want. So we can go into our texture, go up to V-Ray Dirt, which is our AO, and then we can see the results there. Now, just as a quick note, if you want to separate out different objects to use different AOs, you're going to have to use that in a separate render layer, and you would create a material override. And if you do want to use a material override with V-Ray Dirt, you first have to apply a surface shader to the material override, and on the surface shader's out color, then you add in a V-Ray Dirt. Okay, so let's go ahead and render this out and see what we have. In the frame buffer, the way that you cycle through your passes is go up here. You have lighting, so this is direct illumination. Then you have GI, which is going to be indirect illumination. You have your reflections, refractions, specularity. Specular refers to light at specific angles and usually more intense reflections. So we have quite a lot of specularity here, which is pretty good. Next we have self-illumination. These are just going to be for the lights. And then we have AO. AO is supposed to be for very, very soft shadows. This is not really what we want. We want something that's going to be mostly white with just black edges. So I'm going to keep this up. I'm going to zoom out, make this a little bit smaller. What we can do, we can increase the distribution, so kind of like the contrast between the dark and bright areas. And we can also increase the fall off and take a look at what that produces. I'm also going to just lower this radius down. So that's a little bit better. We have a sharper edge here. Now this plane relatively in the scene is pretty small. It's probably not to scale. So we probably should lower the radius a little bit more. So something like this would be pretty good for our AO. So there's one final type of pass that we're going to add here. That's going to be a Z-depth pass. Now what Z-depth does, it calculates the distance between the objects in the scene and the camera. And Z-depth is very useful to create atmospheric perspective and also for depth of field. So atmospheric perspective here is not particularly important, but in the previous example that I showed with the wingman, I did use Z-depth there to be able to have the other plane, which is further away, appear a little bit more faded because there's more atmosphere between it. And then I also used Z-depth for a depth of field calculation as well. Now, depth of field without a plugin in After Effects is not the easiest thing to achieve. However, I do want to show you how to set up the Z-depth pass here. So right here, I'm just going to disable the AO pass because it's going to take a little bit longer to render. I'm going to go to a top view. And on the top view, I'm going to switch over to the master layer so I can actually see the camera. And we're going to add a measurement calculation between the camera and the plane. Go up to Create, Measure Tools, Distance Tool. Then we're just going to select something in front of the camera to about the midpoint of the plane. And it's going to give us the distance between it. So as you can see, this is really not to scale, but it's fine for what we need. But this number is going to be very important. So going back to Z-depth, let's switch back to our plane layer. Click on depth, switch back over to our camera view. And the depth of the entire scene, we should do something that's a bit larger than whatever the distance is. So we could do something like 20. Go back to IPR. And this gives us a pretty good amount of depth, something that we could edit a little bit later. The depth black, we could increase that number a little bit because it's not that dark at the front. So maybe we could do something like 5 and just reset the IPR. That adds a little bit more contrast. And what you should do now is just go throughout the scene and just make sure that it works at different camera positions as well. So this is getting a bit bright, so I'm going to increase the depth white a little bit, maybe try 25. And that's a little bit better. Now, if you did have more objects in the scene that go further back, you would want to go and make sure this value is enough to go past the objects in the background. So now we can go back and make sure the AO is enabled again. So we're going to go back to our exhaust render layer and just make sure that that is set up correctly because this does use a different render engine. So for this, we're going to do the same thing that we did previously. I'm going to set up version numbers. I'm going to right click version label is 2 / render layer / render layer _ version number. For the image format type, we're going to do EXRs. The data type, we don't need full float, 16 is fine. Compression, we'll use zip. And for the naming convention, we do need to change this. It's going to be name.number.extension. Make sure the sky is also set on V-Ray. Go to render elements, make sure the render elements are set to off on the sky since we don't need any of those passes. And now we're ready to render. There are two main ways you can start batching in Maya. One of them is to switch your shelf over here to the rendering tab, go up to render, batch render. However, if you're using a much more intensive scene file, I would recommend closing Maya completely. So we'll close out Maya, navigate to our project folder, then we'll go to scenes, go to the scene file that you've created, right click, and select render from the context menu. This will open up a little window. If this window closes, it means that the render has stopped. It does not mean that the render completed. It just means that it's no longer rendering. So what I also recommend that you do before you walk away, go into your project folder, wait for the images folder to be created, double click, The temp images folder is going to be for anything that you used in the frame buffer, so we don't actually need any of that information. But this first folder here, version 2, we're starting with the plane, and we've got our first EXR. So I would make sure this actually renders. I would double click your EXR, open it. I recommend using XInView for viewing EXRs. I would recommend the full version of XInView and getting all the add-ons, which includes an EXR viewer, much faster than opening up Photoshop every time. But to view EXRs properly, you're going to want to view them in After Effects with the linearized workflow. So I'll be talking about color management and the linear workflow a little bit later. But for now, just keep in mind that anything you see is going to be a lot darker unless it's in After Effects. Alright, so now that the rendering is done, it is time to start compositing. When you launch After Effects, the first thing to do is double-click your project window and then go and select the sequences from your images folder. Double-click the first folder up here, and then it doesn't really matter which file you select as long as Open EXR Sequence is checked. After Effects will figure out that this entire collection is part of a sequence, and then it will automatically import the entire sequence. However, since we have 3 of these, there is a more efficient way to do this, so I'm going to delete that. If we open up the images folder in Windows Explorer, select all 3 of these folders. As long as there aren't any subfolders within these folders, we can simply click and drag these into the images folder. All right, so if we click on the first one here, if you notice up in the data, it says it's at 30 FPS, but in Maya, we worked at 24 FPS, which is standard for visual effects. So let's right click, go to Interpret Footage, Main, and then we're going to assume a frame rate of 24. We also need to go up to Color Management, and under Interpret as Linear Light, we need to force this to be on. What this means is by default, After Effects will only interpret a sequence as having linear light if it is a 32 bits per channel file. Now we rendered out a raw or linear image sequence, but we only did it in a 16-bit per channel format. So by default, After Effects is not going to recognize that, so we need to force it to be on. Then we can click OK. And since we have 3 of these files, we can save the settings from the first one we changed and apply it to the other ones. To do that, we right click over the first one, go to Interpret Footage again, remember interpretation, then we select the other 2. Right click again, Interpret Footage, Apply Interpretation. Now both of these will use the same settings. I'm going to grab this plane sequence here and click and drag it into this comp film strip icon. What this does, it makes a composition that is the same length as the sequence with the same size and frame rate. Let's magnify this by clicking this button down here and fit up to 100%. This sequence is 200 frames, but generally for visual effects, you will put a slate on your first frame. We need to increase the length of our composition by 1 frame. Now to do this, we need to be viewing frames. If you don't see a frame counter here and you only see time code like this, which is hours, minutes, seconds, frames, hold down the Control key and select, and this will switch it to frames. Next, you can right click over the title of the composition, go to Composition Settings. You can also do it in the project window, and you can also do it in the menu up here, Composition Settings, or you can use the shortcut key Control K. So for the duration, I'm just going to change this to be 201. Click OK. We're going to increase the Time Navigator end so we can view the entire composition. Click Page Down on the keyboard to go forward 1 frame, or you can just type it in here. And with the layer selected, click the left bracket key. This will snap the layer's starting position to the position of the time navigator. Do the same thing with the exhaust and the sky layers. Drag these underneath, and then again, click the left bracket key. Make sure your sky is underneath your exhaust. So right now we're looking at the master layer. As if we were to render this from the frame buffer, this is what it would look like. If you could include the exhaust in with the master layer by default, which we can't since this is using hardware 2.0 and the sky and the plane are using V-Ray. The advantage is now we can solo just the sky, the exhaust, and the plane and make adjustments to them separately. Now what we're looking at here is the beauty pass of the plane. So this is what you would look at in the frame buffer. It does not include AO, it does not include Z-depth. It includes all the other passes that we used. So the very first thing that we need to do is separate this plane into all its separate passes. But before we do that, we are going to rename this one to be the plane beauty. So click Enter on the keyboard. And notice when I click Enter, this changes from source name to layer name. Layer name is whatever we rename the file. Source name is what the original file name is. We're going to duplicate this layer with Control D. Unsolo these now. And the very first pass that we're going to add is the GI or global illumination layer. So we're looking for an extractor effect. So the EXtractoR effect, if you notice, it says EXR, they're all capitalized, and this is a way of separating passes of a multi-channeled EXR file. So to do that, we're going to select anywhere in this blank space, go into layers, and here we can see all of the different passes that we specified in V-Ray. So we're going to start with GI. Notice also that the RGB values are all changed to the GI equivalent. So we have GI for R, G, and B respectively. Click OK. And now you will notice that this is looking very, very dark. So this is something that we need to do right at the very beginning, but I just wanted to show you the result because sometimes it's not evident if you make these adjustments beforehand. We need to set up our working space. So click where it says 32 BPC. This might say 8 or 16 for you. Select this. This is an absolutely vital part of compositing. You need to make sure you're using a linear workflow and you have set up the correct working space. I need to move the project window down here so it can fit on the screen. Select where it says none, and you want to go up here to sRGB. sRGB is the standard working space for most computers and monitors, at least Windows monitors. So this is using a gamma of 2.2, and then we need to linearize the working space. So by clicking linearize, you'll notice that the color changes. If you forget to linearize your working space and then you realize halfway through your project that you didn't do it, you will have to recomposite nearly everything because the values are very different. To view the same colors and values that we saw in Maya, we have to linearize. So before we separate out all the passes, go back up to this extractor and we need to unmultiply it. If you notice on this edge here, it gets a little bit darker when we don't unmultiply it. Now the unmultiplier effect is a way of removing the background from areas of partial transparency, or in this case, it's just motion blur. So if I were to solo this layer and select my transparency toggle, you can see that this area is a little bit transparent. If we turn this off, you'll notice that areas of the alpha channel that are not occupied by pixels by default will render as black. And because this is black, we get a really thin black edge around the plane. Sometimes it is not necessary to unmultiply, but quite often it is, so it's safer just to check mark the box. So right now we're going to duplicate these passes. Just go one by one, change the EXtractoR effect, and change the pass name. So the next pass is going to be the lighting pass. The lighting pass is going to be our direct illumination, and the blending mode for lighting is going to be additive. So we come up here to add. One more thing before we continue. If you do not see your blending modes here, there might be a toggle switches. So you can select this button to toggle between your switches, which are these, and your modes, which are your blending modes and track mats. If you'd like to see them both on the same panel, which I recommend, right click on layer name, go to columns, and then select switches and or modes, whichever one is not selected, and then both of them will be on one panel. If you have a large enough monitor, I highly recommend this. It's far more efficient than having to click a button every time. Okay, so next we can duplicate lighting, rename the next one to be reflection. This again is going to be additive. Specular, which is also additive. Refraction, which is additive. And self-illumination, which is also additive. Next we have ambient occlusion, or AO. Ambient occlusion is multiplied. And lastly, we have Z-depth. Now for Z-depth, you'll notice that if you select Z, the RGB values do not change. This is because the Z-depth channel contains no color information and it only contains a single channel. To get any non-color channel to work properly, go into the each RGB channel and select the channel name. Now Z-depth is not composited with a blending mode, so we're just going to set this to be normal, and then we'll turn this layer off and use it later. Now we can unsolo all of these and have a look at the entire result. In your project folder, just go ahead and make a new folder called comps. Now, when you save version numbers, you should always save the same version number as whatever the latest render that you did in Maya. The latest render was version 2, so you should save your After Effects composition as version 2 as well. This makes it much easier to go back and forth between projects, and clients can use the version number to tell you what they liked and what they didn't like, and that same version number corresponds to a composition and also corresponds to a scene file. And if you're using After Effects and Maya consistently, going back and forth between them, make sure you always have the same version number for the comp and the Maya scene, and all your frames have the version number on them as well. Otherwise, it's very easy to forget which version corresponds with which file, and it can make your life hell to try to figure that out, especially weeks after you've worked on something and a client finally responds or something like that. Just go ahead and make sure these always are the same as your Maya scene file. Click OK. Let's set this to half resolution so this renders a little bit faster. Let's go to the very beginning and then just click the spacebar. This will load in the sequence into your PC's RAM, and then it will play in real time. Now, depending on the size and the length of your composition and how much RAM you have in your PC, you may not be able to load in the entire shot. In this case, we only have 200 frames, so we can. It'll make it a little bit easier to check what we rendered. Alright, so now this is loaded in the RAM. We can see that it is now playing at 24 FPS, and there are a few things right away that I noticed that need to be corrected. So when you load in your sequence and you get everything composited, the very first thing that you should check are all the passes being viewed correctly. So when I was compositing mine, all of them appeared to be correct. None of the passes were black. So a lot of students have this problem where their reflection and specular passes are completely black. This generally indicates that in V-Ray, you either have the amount set to 0, you have a black map placed in the reflection channel, or you have a glossiness of 1. And if you have a glossiness of 1 with no HDR image and only one object that you're rendering, it's very difficult to get reflections to show up properly. The same thing can happen with GI. So just go back through, make sure you're using an HDR image, or you have at least an environment set up. You've placed your reflection maps in the correct channel. Your maps are not black and your mounts are not at 0. Those are the easiest things to fix, but some of the most common mistakes that I see. As far as the composition goes, the nose of the plane gets very, very close to the edge. It's almost touching, so I want to fix that. I want to pull this out a little bit more. Likewise, the exhaust does not extend far enough back. And then right at the very end here, I'm noticing that the camera kind of just like hits a wall. It just seems to stop at around frame 120. It just seems to hit and then just slide. It's not very smooth, so I want to go ahead and fix that as well. Also looking at the glass here, the refraction looks a little bit too strong. It's kind of warping the image behind it a little bit too much. Glass is not going to be that thick, so we want to go back and correct that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and set up another render, and then we can come back and composite. All right, so in Maya, the very first thing I mentioned was the camera not being zoomed out far enough. So I want to go ahead and do that. So we're going to up version this file, save a version 3, select the camera, and then I'm just going to pull out just a little bit. I'm going to set this back to 200. Also getting 2 keyframes here, so that's probably part of the problem. Pull back out a little bit. To have a closer inspection of these keyframes, we're going to open up the graph editor. And yeah, this is a problem here. I don't like these keyframes. You seem to have 2 keyframes very close. I'm just going to delete those. Move this off to the side here. Yeah, and that solves that problem. One thing that I would like to do though, I'm going to take these keyframes here, so I'm just holding down the shift key and clicking and dragging over these keyframes, moving this over to frame 200. So this is looking a little bit better. I think what I'd like to do though is around frame 160, I'm going to take this plane and maybe at around frame 120, I'll set a keyframe, go to frame 160, and then just pull up the wing, let it bank a little bit. And then by frame 200, it can go back, just so we can maybe see just a little bit underneath the wing. I'll select the camera again, and at frame 160, I'll just lower the angle just a tad. We're going to have to zoom out a little bit more. And at around frame 60, we're going to pull the camera down just to get this more in frame. Another thing that I'd like to add is a little bit of camera shake in After Effects. So pulling out this far will allow us to be able to crop back in after we add the camera shake. So I'm pretty happy with this right now. I think this will be okay. Next thing that we can do here is go into the exhaust and scale both of these exhaust objects back. So the furthest out I think we see is probably around here. So as long as I clear the canvas, we should be good. Pull these out. And we're also going to have to go into the flare handle, and take the high bound back up, maybe to around 3. Otherwise it's going to bulge too soon. Something like that should be good. One more thing I'd like to do is go into perspective view here really fast. Select the pilot's head, and I'm just going to add just a little bit of animation to this pilot. Will make it feel a little bit more alive. So maybe as the camera's coming down, it kind of glances up at the camera, then looks back the other way. It's a little bit of really subtle motion, but make it look a little bit more realistic. This guy, he's not doing anything important right now. He can just look up around here. You can look back. Give this guy just a little bit more movement on his head. Make it look a little bit more realistic there. Something just really subtle, but something that we might notice in the final result. Okay. I also mentioned the glass had a little bit too much refraction on it. So let's go into the canopy glass, go down to the refraction IOR, and for this we're going to turn on IPR. And we're looking at some of the distortion around the edge here. And one thing you can do with IPR is a little bit more convenient than rendering the entire thing. If we select this little icon up here, it turns on the region render, then we can just click and drag a region that we'd like to focus on, and it's not going to waste time rendering anything else. And I'll try a refraction of 1.2. That looks a little bit better. If we look at from some different angles, yeah, that looks a little bit more realistic. Turn off the region render. I just want to have a look at the overall lighting here. And one other thing that I'm noticing is I kind of want this screen left side of the plane to be a little bit brighter. And this would just allow the plane to look a little bit more visually interesting in our composite. So one thing I can do, I could go into the HDR and make it a little bit brighter, but perhaps what would be a little easier here is to just create a directional light and line it up with the sun in the HDRI. Let's go up to Create Lights, Directional Light. Just gonna rotate this around, pull this up. Just tilt this down a little bit. I'm going to turn IPR on again. I don't want any of the light to brighten the screen right side of the plane, so pull this up a little bit. So that's looking a little bit too bright, so I'll go ahead and just drop that down to maybe 0.5. And if we compare this on, off, on, I think that's going to help our composite just a little bit. All right, I don't think there was anything else that we needed to fix. Let's go ahead and just make sure this is set up properly again. Version label, we need to update that to be 3. For now, we're going to still leave the max render time pretty low and just go ahead and make sure that we are updating everything that we need to. So in this case, we did change the camera, so all of our layers have to be re-rendered. If we were only making changes to, let's say, the plane, then we'd only have to re-render the plane. All right, so while we're waiting for that new render to finish, we can go ahead and start setting up our color correction and doing some other adjustments as well. So the very first thing that I want to do is some color correction. So I'm going to select this top layer up here, right click at the bottom, go to new adjustment layer, type in color correction. And I mentioned earlier that in V-Ray, there was a way to transfer the color information from the frame buffer into After Effects. I want to show that really fast here. I'll go back to maybe an angle like this and do a proper render. I'll turn on my image adjustments, and we had this curves effect on here, which is making everything a bit brighter. We also have things like the white balance, which will be color temperature. We can make the image warmer. So let's say I was really pleased with the color of this, and I wanted to save this exact color correction, and I wanted to use this same color correction inside of After Effects. You go up here to Globals, click Save. We'll just save this in Comps. And we'll call this Plain Version 3, and we're looking for a LUT file. So in After Effects, you can add an effect called Apply Color LUT. And what this does, it is a lookup table, which will use the same values and color correction in V-Ray and across other platforms as well. It is a common format for transferring color information. Quite often clients will send you this if they have a color that they are happy with and they want all the artists to be using the exact color correction. So that is how you apply a LUT. I'm not actually going to use one in this case. I'm going to do my color correction manually. I'm going to just turn this off and add a curves effect. So with curves, what I want to do here is I want to make the highlights and midtones just a bit brighter, and then I'm going to darken the shadows to add a bit more contrast. Something more like this. I'm going to go into the red channel and pull out a little bit of red from the shadows. Then I'm going to allow the reds and the highlights to creep back into their original values, which is this straight line here. So just toggling between this, we've made the clouds a little bit more blue. We pulled out some of that red. We've added a little bit more contrast. Next, I'm going to add a Lumetri Color effect. Now the Lumetri Color gives us a lot of adjustments all in one effect, which is nice, and it is the only way inside of After Effects to change the color temperature without using a photo filter. So I'm going to turn on high dynamic range, and then in the temperature gauge, we can just increase the temperature, do a value of around 90, and make it look a little bit warmer, like it's sunset. Now unfortunately, these values are not in Kelvin, which normally color temperature is in Kelvin, but the higher the number, the warmer the image in this case. We also have a lot of options for highlights and shadows. So for example, if we wanted to boost the shadows a little bit, because they are looking slightly dark, we could do a value of around 30. Now all of these adjustments you can use in curves, but it gets a little bit more complicated. So it is nice sometimes to be able to have just highlights or just shadow control. Next, we can also add some contrast here without having to use an additional curves. Maybe something at around 40 would be a good value. Now, one thing that we do have to be careful with when adding contrast and brightness especially is clipping. Now, clipping is when the value of a pixel exceeds the working space. So in this case, this is going beyond 8-bit and my monitor can no longer display these values properly. I'm just using a standard 8-bit monitor, and any value up here, these are floating point values. So 1 represents the limit of an 8-bit working space. So any value that goes beyond 1 means that the value cannot be displayed properly, and there's no subtle gradient between higher level values. Anything at 1, that's the highest it can go. So if there's pixels that are even brighter than that, it's just going to stop at 1. If I were to add another curves effect here to really extenuate this effect, you'll notice a really harsh line that appears. So this looks quite poor. It's something that you always want to avoid. We're going to just delete this curves. That was just as an example. And we're going to either lower our brightness of the curves, or we can use another effect called the HDR highlight compression. So the HDR highlight compression is a way of tone mapping high dynamic range values to low dynamic range values, or HDR to LDR. So in this case, what it does, it tries to make sure there's nothing that's going to clip, which it does, but it makes the image look very gray. There are tone mappers that work a lot better than this, but if we lock this off at maybe a value of around 30, I might just lower this brightness of the curves a little bit here. And you want to make sure there's no values getting above 1. So this looks pretty good now. We go into full resolution here, then have a look at these pilot's visors. You can see there's some highlights on them that are clipping. They're getting really, really bright. So because we have this refraction pass on a separate layer, we don't need to fix our overall color correction to simply fix these pixels. Instead, what we can do is go down to our refraction layer. We can solo this layer and apply an HDR highlight compression on it. This is going to be much dimmer. We can go back. So underneath our color correction, we can add an additional adjustment layer and call this vignette. Place this underneath our color correction. And there is an effect called vignette. Just drag this on. And for now, we'll just leave the default values. Basically, it's just going to help pull our eye into the shot a little bit more. One other thing that I'm noticing here with the contrast of the intakes, they're looking very, very dark. So if we mouse over these intakes, we're getting values of 0, 0, 0 in the upper right-hand corner. It's not just bright values that can clip, it's also dark values, and here we're definitely getting clipping. So let's go back to our color correction layer, and on this curves effect, we'll zoom in on our curves, pull this up very slightly. You do have to be careful with it, don't go up too high. So we're going to zoom in a little bit more here, and just lift this up very slightly. Then we can zoom back out. So these values are no longer clipped. So the next thing we're going to do is make the exhaust. So we already have a matte for the exhaust, which is fine. I'm going to rename this layer to be exhaust matte. And underneath the exhaust matte, we're going to grab an adjustment layer. Let's call this exhaust. Now on the exhaust layer, we're going to change the track matte to be alpha. Exhaust is going to disappear, but that's just because we're using a track matte and there's nothing on this adjustment layer yet. To make this show up, we're just going to grab a curves effect and then just darken down the value. Something around there will be good. We can also add some heat distortion with a turbulent displace effect. We can set the amount to be 100 and the size to be 5, flexity maybe around 3. And you'll notice that it is kind of wobbling the clouds a little bit. Hold down Alt and click on the stopwatch next to evolution, then type in time multiplied by 1000. So this is going to allow it to constantly wobble. This looks really, really strong right now. Don't worry, it'll look okay in a moment. We can either adjust the curves values, or we can go and click T and then just lower the opacity. So we're going to just increase these curves a little bit, make it not quite so dark. We could also add a fractal noise pattern over the top of this. We can change the blending mode to be multiplied. The noise type, we could say dynamic. Go into the transform and then just reduce the scale quite a bit. And we can also do the same thing with evolution. Type in time, asterisk, and then maybe something like 2000. Because this does not track with the plane, it's just kind of everywhere over the entire comp. We want it to move around quite a bit. And then we could even lower the opacity of this so it's not quite so strong. We want it to be fairly subtle. We just want an essence of it being there. I think this will look pretty good. We'll have to just see it rendered before I can make those judgments. So moving on now, I want to do the depth of field. Depth of field is the way that the camera is going to focus on different elements of the shot. If you have a really shallow depth of field, objects closer to the camera or further away, depending on where the focal point is, are going to become a lot more blurry. Now for aerial aviation photography, it's unlikely we'd see a shallow depth of field because the photographer or the cameraman is going to have the f-stop up pretty high. However, we can still add a little bit, and especially if we look later on in the shot, maybe around frame 150, it would make sense for this part of the plane to be the focal point, and the rest might begin to just get out of focus just ever so slightly. So in order to do depth of field properly in After Effects, it is a little bit tricky to do. There is a plugin that takes a lot of the hassle out of this, but there is a way to do it natively in After Effects. So before we do that, we're going to go down to this plane beauty shot. Just noticed this needs to be at the top, and we turn it off. We don't usually need this plane beauty, but we can just leave it there for reference later. If you remember, the plane beauty is simply what was rendered from the frame buffer with all of the passes already composited. So we don't actually need this one, so we'll just turn this off. Next, we're going to go into the plane depth. We're going to make a copy of it. Click Ctrl-Shift-C or right click and do pre-compose. Move all attributes into the new composition. Double click this layer. Right now we're looking at just the Z depth. Now this needs a bit more contrast on it, but right now we're going to add a background. And the background, we're going to sample the color of the wing at the back end of the plane and place this layer underneath. It kind of makes it look like the plane is coming through some fog here. This is fine. Now the reason we have to do this is because without this layer, the depth of field will stop wherever the plane stops, and that's not how real focusing would work, so we can't just single out separate objects. Otherwise, it's not going to look correct. Pop back over to plane 2, and we're going to add a new adjustment layer underneath and call this depth of field. And we'll be using 2 of these Z depth passes, so we're going to rename this one as well. We'll just call this DOF for depth of field. So on the depth of field, we're going to grab a camera lens blur effect. Alright, so right away you'll notice that when we put on the camera lens blur effect, everything is coated in the same amount of blur. So to change that and actually use that depth of field map, we're going to go into the blur map, change the layer to be the plane Z depth DOF, and then we need to change this from source to effects and masks. So we can put curves effects on this Z depth layer, and then it will propagate those results through. Otherwise it will only look at the source. Alright, I'm going to zoom out here, and I'm going to crank this value up to be some ridiculous value, just so we can see this very clearly. Now right away you'll notice that the edges look a little bit odd, and that's because anything that's blurred up to the edge of a canvas, since there are no pixels outside of it, it's going to give this kind of effect. So repeat edge pixels attempts to fix that. Next, what we're going to do is select our plane Z depth DOF layer, turn it on so we can see what we're doing, and then add a curves effect to it. So we need to crush these black values quite a bit to really begin to see what we're doing. We want the front end of the plane to be black, and we do want to try to smooth out this transition. We don't want there to be a hard edge here. Turn this layer back off. And now you can see that this is currently in focus, this part right here. Go into the depth of field and change our blur focal distance. We'll just start increasing this slightly. And as we increase it, it's going to shift the position that's in focus. So we're looking for maybe a value of around 0.1 or maybe 0.05. So it's more or less in the center there. The rest looks absolutely ridiculous and not realistic at all, but this was just so we could figure out what part is in focus very clearly. Now we can drop the blur radius back down to something like 5, and this is going to look a lot more realistic. So this part is in focus. And then as we get further away from the plane, it gets a little bit softer, has more of a film look to it. So it is reasonable to expect that the edges might get a little bit more blurred. You can always lower this value if you want to, but this looks pretty good. Another thing that you'll notice is that the clouds look a lot better. So without the lens blur on, we get a lot of artifacting from the pretty low sampling time that we had in V-Ray. So by adding just a little bit of blur, we kind of get rid of a lot of that without having to do a higher sampling rate. Now we will go ahead and do that because there's areas around here which is still far too grainy, but for this large area of background, adding a little bit of blur goes a long way in clearing that up. I'm going to rename this effect to be my depth of field, DOF. I'm also going to add a second camera lens blur effect underneath this, and I'll put the value quite low at around 0.3. So it will coat the entire scene again in another layer of blur, but it's going to add just a tad amount of blur here. We might even lower that to 0.2, just so it's not so sharp when we re-render. We might also just lower this very slightly. If you want to do 4.5 or maybe 4, might look a little bit better now. Also, you need to check from different positions. The further we get away from this, the more out of focus it's going to appear by default. So if we wanted to here, if we go to the very end of the composition, you'll notice that the plane is much darker. So there's going to be far less blur at the front end of the plane. But at the beginning, the plane is quite bright. So to make this image look a little bit better, what we're going to have to do is go into the Z depth layer, and you'll notice that the background blends in with the tail towards the end of the shot, but at the beginning is really not bright enough. So I'm going to add a curves effect to this light gray solid. At around frame 130, this appears to be pretty good, maybe 140. I'm going to set a keyframe on the curves. And I'm going to go to the very beginning. And at the very beginning, I'm just going to crush these white values up so they're a bit brighter. That kind of blends in a little bit better, because we want to make sure the background is always not really the focal point of this. It's always going to be the plane. Next, we can pop back out to the main composition, and you can see that now the plane is sticking out more. The nose is always darker than the background. Okay. So we can now turn this back off and then move on to the next part. Okay, so now that my renders have finished, I want to show you how we can easily import new files. So up here, we'll just start with exhaust. Right click on exhaust, go to replace footage with file. We're going to navigate to the version 3 folder, go to exhaust, and you can see that this is now being updated. Grab the plane, do the same thing. Right click, replace footage, file. Go to the plane. See, the plane is now being updated. And then we're also going to do the sky as well. Okay, it's very, very simple to import new versions of files, and just scrub through this and just make sure everything looks pretty good. I like the wing being brighter there. I think that's going to be better. And I like seeing underneath the plane too. There's one last thing that we can do with Z-depth, and that's going to be atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective is going to be if there is atmosphere or air between the viewer or the camera and the subject, the further that distance is, the more faded the subject is going to look, because there's more atmosphere in the way. So I could go into a whole lecture on this, but I'm going to just try to sum that up pretty quickly. And we're going to control this again with Z-depth. So we're going to leave Z-depth here, but what we're going to do next is turn off all of these passes except for GI. So we just want to keep one of these on so we can work at one at a time and then just copy and paste the effects as we go up. But we need to be able to see what we're doing just on one layer. So we're looking for an effect called the set matte effect. So the set matte effect is a way of being able to use a matte without having to put a track matte directly above the layer. Since we're going to be using this matte several times, it's much more convenient to use the set matte effect. We're going to be using the plain Z-depth layer. And then for this, we're again going to use effects and masks. And we're going to be looking at the luminance channel, so the bright values. So when you do that, you'll notice that the plane goes partially transparent. So if I were to solo this layer, toggle the transparency grid, you can see it's more faded at the front than the back, which is the opposite effect that we want. So we'll go into the invert matte, and now it's more faded at the back. So this might be a little bit too faded, but for right now, this is fine. We can go and correct this in a moment. But one thing that you will notice, the way this effect works, it is going to make the plane more faded. So we're going to fix that in a moment. But before we do that, we're just going to select this set matte effect, copy it. We can turn on these layers again, and then we're going to paste each one of these passes. We don't paste it on Z-depth. That is the matte. We don't need to add anything there. So this looks way too transparent right now. So let's go up into our plain Z-depth layer and add a curves effect. We'll turn this on so we can see it more clearly. The front end of the plane is going to need to be a lot darker. So actually what we're going to do here, we're going to take this, crush the black values, maybe do something more like this. For a plane this small, you're not going to notice a huge amount of difference from the front end to the back end, but if you had multiple planes in the shot, you would probably want to do this a lot more on the planes in the distance. But something like this will give us a really subtle effect, but it should work pretty well. So if we just look through different angles here, we should be able to get a good read of how this is going to react. So the further away the camera is, the more faded it should be. This is looking a little too faded though, so we are going to need to crush the black values a bit more and reduce the contrast. So right here, it is looking a little faded, but let's just go ahead and see what it looks like when it is composited. Let's turn this Z-depth layer off. So we can see that it's far too faded here, but we can fix that in a moment. What we need to do now though is fix the fact that we can see through the background. So to fix this, we're going to go down to our plain GI layer, just duplicate that and move the duplicate underneath, and then rename the duplicate to be plain matte. So let's solo this layer so we can look at it unobstructed. Let's solo this layer and toggle off our transparency grid. Instead of using the GI layer here, what we're going to use is the alpha. So for R, G, and B, we can just say alpha, 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 and then click OK. We do not need a set matte effect, so we can just delete it. And now we're just left with an outline of the plane. A faster alternative to this is to simply use a fill effect over whatever layer you have. You can just do something like this to color it in. That's perfectly fine. So it's either change the extractor to be alpha only or fill it in. Turn this layer off, and then next we're going to need a copy of our sky. We'll duplicate the sky and place the sky right underneath the plane map and rename this layer to be sky blurred. So the track matte on the sky blurred layer is going to be an alpha matte of the plane matte. Solo this, and you can see that the background is now showing up in an outline of the plane. So we need to blur the sky. So we'll add a fast box blur. And then for the blur radius, we'll do a value of around 50. We will repeat edge pixels. We shouldn't actually ever get to the edge, but just put it on, just always do it. Now we're only caring about averaged values here. So as the plane moves through the sky, it's going to blur these values. So if this is not blurred enough, maybe increase this to 100 because we're looking more for the average value. Turn this back off. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And also we need to save this to a version 3 file since we are using new frames. So version 3. So to really see if this Z depth is doing anything, if we turn off the curves effect, we can see how faded it is without the curves. This looks pretty good. So we're getting slightly more fading at the back than we are at the front. This might be more evident at the beginning, which it is. We're quite a bit further away from the plane. This looks a little bit silly though. So what we're going to do to fix these frames at the beginning, we're going to grab another curves and we're going to animate these curves, turn this plane Z depth layer on. By frame 80, it looks like this part of the plane is pitch black. So we'll set a keyframe there. At the beginning, we need to crush in the black values a bit more. And then we'll lower these white values again. Something more like this. Click U so we can see the keyframes. I'll select this keyframe, click F9 to ease it out. Let's turn this layer back off. And this looks a little bit better. You can always go ahead and change these, but we do want to make sure that this is animated. Now, unfortunately with curves, it's very difficult to animate them between two keyframes. So if you did want to go ahead and reanimate this, you're going to have to go to a key position that you've keyframed and then you can change them. All right, so this is beginning to look a lot better now. There's just a few more things that we need to do, and then I'm going to go ahead and add some bloom to this. So this next part, I want to look at the lights on the wings. So I'm going to take the self-illumination layer, solo this, and I'm going to add a glow effect. Add the glow, I'll lower the threshold, and then we're going to just lower the opacity down to about 75%, and I think that's going to look a little bit more subtle. Another thing I'm noticing at the beginning of the shot, the front of the plane is looking a little bit too blurred. And this is because in version 3, we pulled the camera out quite a lot, so the depth matte needs to be adjusted. So we're going to go ahead and fix that as well. So we're going to go back up to this plane Z depth comp, double click, and we animated a curves effect to try to match the background with the back of the plane. We're just going to tweak some of those values and make it blend a little bit more, especially here. And then at the very end, we'll add another keyframe, something more like that. And then we'll add another curves effect. And at around frame 70, I think this is looking pretty good. We turn this back on. We'll set a keyframe there. And at frame 1, we can barely see it anymore. So we're going to crush the black values here. So the nose of the plane will begin to appear. And we need that to be dark. So the dark area indicates what is in focus. So we can do something like that. And as soon as we go back, we can see that this is going to look a lot more in focus. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is just brighten up the background a little bit. We'll go to our sky layer, add a curves effect, and boost the values of the sky. And next we're going to add some bloom. Now bloom is going to be where the highlights glow. This is often seen in film or with photography where brighter objects have kind of a glow to them. Often it's overdone in games, but it does give a nice visual effect, and I'd like to add it to this plane. I'm going to try to find a better angle here towards the beginning of the shot. And we're going to just take a copy of the beauty pass, duplicate that, and just rename it to be bloom. We'll turn this layer on and then solo it. So it's possible to do in After Effects, which I'm going to show you here. It's also possible to do in V-Ray as well. So in V-Ray, you can add bloom by going into the frame buffer, selecting this icon down here, and enabling the bloom and glare effect. Now I have set these values to something that would make it show up. By default, it may not appear to do anything. The most important effects to get it to work are going to be increasing the intensity and lowering the threshold. You also probably want to turn off hardware acceleration because this often does cause problems, at least in the times that I've used it. And you can see around all the highlights of the plane, we're getting this glow. Now this can be saved out as a render element or a pass. So by selecting this, going up to your passes, you can select glare and you would get an effect like this. Now this is perfectly fine to go ahead and use this. However, I want to show you a way that we can do it in After Effects. So we have this copy of the beauty pass, and on this pass, we're going to add a set matte effect. Now, usually you don't use a set matte effect as the layer that it's on, but in this case it's okay. So we're just going to use itself. So we're using the same layer. I'm going to change it from alpha channel to luminance. I'm going to grab a curves effect. I'm going to crush the black values and then boost some of the midtones back up. Next, we're going to add a glow effect. Now, the standard glow effect does not have a realistic fall off. If I lower my threshold, increase the radius, it doesn't have a natural fall off. It just stays pretty consistent. There is an effect called Real Glow, which does a much better job of this. So if you can find this plugin, I'm not sure if it's available anymore, but it is a very good plugin. It handles glow and bloom in a much more realistic way. I'm sure there's other plugins as well. However, we're gonna work with this and get it to do what we need. I'm gonna turn off the solo. And I'm going to set the mode to be screen. Now, the difference between add and screen is that add will allow the addition of all the pixels on this layer and below to exceed 8-bit and enter high dynamic range, where screen clamps the values at 1. By using screen, you avoid clipping, at least from the layer that you're blending. So the layer itself is quite bright, but if we were to compare this with add, we can see clear amounts of clipping here. We're almost getting values of 2. By setting this back down to screen, we're not getting such harsh results. I am still going to use a HDR highlight compression effect, and I'm just going to leave that on at 100% for now. All right, so I'm pretty pleased with that. I need to see this whole thing rendered out to really know for certain. But we only have 2 more things left to do. Then we can go ahead and render out final frames of this, and after that, render out the composition. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to add some camera shake. We're going to go ahead and do that really fast. Go up to here, add a new null object. Now on the camera shake null object, we're going to add 2 slider effects. Click enter, and we're going to rename the first one frequency, and the second one is going to be intensity. Then we're going to duplicate both of these effects. And on the second one, we can just call it rotation. We're going to grab all of the layers underneath. We're not going to grab the color correction or the vignette or the camera shake itself. And then you can either use the pick whip and attach all of these layers to the camera shake layer, or you can go into the parent link option and just select it this way. Next, we're going to open up the position. So click P, hold down the Alt key and click the stopwatch for position. Then we're going to type in wiggle, open parentheses, then take the pick whip and attach the first parameter to the slider control of frequency. Do a comma, space, and then take the pick whip again and grab the slider control for intensity. So the wiggle effect takes 2 parameters. The first one is going to be frequency, so how many times per second the value can wiggle or just move around. And the second parameter is going to be how many pixels or how many units of whatever channel you're on can move. So in this case, we're using pixels because we're using a position transform. Then we can just click the numpad enter key. And for the frequency, we might try a value of around 2 and the intensity of around 10. And when we do this, you'll notice perhaps even more if you increase the intensity. So if we did something like 50, we'll notice that we're going to get a border. Depending on the size of your intensity, you will have to scale up this layer. So we're going to hold down the shift key and click S to open up the scale. And I'm going to increase the size of this null object by maybe 2%. You'll have to scrub through and just make sure that that is consistent. You might need to do a little bit more depending on what your intensity is. Next, we're going to hold down shift and click R. Then we're going to add an expression to the rotation channel. Again, we're going to be using wiggle. Then we can attach the first parameter to the frequency rotation, comma, then grab the intensity rotation. Then click the numpad enter key or just click off to the side. Now for rotation, we want to do something that's really, really subtle. So I'll actually do 0.5. So it's going to be every 2 seconds. And then for the intensity, we'll only do a maximum of 1 degree. And the reason we're using slider controls is so you can animate the camera shake. If you were just to use these numbers directly in the wiggle function, that's fine to do, but there's no easy way to animate those values. So if you put them in sliders, you can control the values at any point just with basic keyframing. So throughout the animation, this is just going to kind of wobble around. And with the rotation, we will need to scale this up just a little bit more. We're getting a little black edge there. To be safe, I'm just going to say 105. Now earlier, I mentioned that I needed to pull the camera out a little bit further because I knew that I was going to have to scale in. So always make sure that you don't have your subject touching the edges of the composition, so you can always crop a little bit of the plate. Okay, so I think that's going to look pretty good when we render it. Now with camera shake, we are actually moving all of these layers. And anytime you move anything in After Effects, you need to add motion blur. So we are going to select all of these layers, and then we need to select the motion blur switch, which is going to be this button here. So we just line it up, and then make sure that this switch is enabled for the comp. This allows motion blur to be enabled everywhere. I'm going to close that. And we have one final adjustment to make. We're going to go into layer, new adjustment layer. And we're going to add some film grain. Grain needs to go underneath your color correction, and we're looking for an add grain effect. By default, you get this little preview window, so you need to change the viewing mode to be final output. And the default grain is quite hideous. So on the intensity, we need to change the intensity to something like 0.1, and then the size also down to something like 0.1. This is supposed to be a very, very subtle effect, but in areas where there's shadow, like in the intakes and in the cockpit, cameras will always have even a little bit of grain. And if everything in your plate is super clean, this is going to look a little bit unrealistic. So we're going to maybe drop that down to 0.05, and that looks a bit better. All right, so now the only thing that we have to do is render out a higher quality version of just the plane. So after adding the camera lens blur and adding the grain, I think the quality of the plate is fine. So we don't need to go ahead and render that out again. So we need to pop back over to Maya. I don't actually need to render bloom, so I'm going to turn that off. If you do render bloom, you can do it as a separate pass, and then you can choose to use it if you want to. I'm gonna close this down. I up version this to version 4. So we need to go into our render settings, do the same for our version label here, then go into the V-Ray tab and change the max render time up to 1 minute. Now this is going to be dependent on your PC's hardware, so 1 minute on a supercomputer is going to be very different to 1 minute on a laptop. It will be a lot better than just a 6-second render. So a full minute is going to produce a much cleaner image. We only need to render the plane layer. That's selected. Everything else looks fine. And then we can go ahead and render this out. I made one slight error here. This plane bloom layer needs to be underneath our depth of field layer. Otherwise it's not going to blur in the same way. But now we can go ahead and load in plane version 4, place the footage with the new plane version. I'm going to up version our comp as well to version 4. And now we're ready to render the preview. Let's go over and rename our composition name, composition settings. This is now version 4. Whatever this is would be your file name. Then we're going to go up to composition, add to Adobe Media Encoder queue. This will launch the Media Encoder. It might take a few seconds, maybe even up to a minute to transfer this, depending on the speed of your PC and if you have used the encoder before. So if this doesn't load up right away, don't panic. Next, we're going to click on H.264. And again, this process can take several seconds. Here you can change the format to something else, but we're going to leave that on H.264. We're going to leave the output name the same. All of these basic video settings, these are going to be taken from the After Effects composition. So if something is incorrect here, you need to go back to After Effects, fix it there, and then send it back over. We are going to render at maximum depth, and for the bitrate, we are going to use variable bitrate, or VBR 1 pass. There's not a huge amount of size difference between 1 pass and 2 pass, but a 2 pass does take twice as long. So on the target bitrate, we're going to say 20, and then for the maximum, we're going to say 25. If you're rendering in 4K, you would probably need to boost this. The target should be around 40, and maybe the maximum around 50, but for 1080, this is fine. Then we're going to use the maximum render quality as well. Click OK, and then click the green start button. Then I'll come and show you the final result. Here's the preview rendered out, and this would be appropriate to send off for a client review. I also have an alternate version of this that I did a few years ago. So you got the wingman in there, got a different HDR and a slightly different animation. Alright guys, thank you so much for watching. If you made it through all the videos, I really appreciate it. The series took a lot of time and effort to put together, so I hope you guys think it's worthwhile, or at least you learned something that you didn't before. Alright, so if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Otherwise, I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.